The Honda Civic Type R nameplate spans almost 3 decades, and within that you've got some of the greatest hits from the world of hot hatchbacks. This is the new FL5 Honda Civic Type R, and let's address the elephant in the room. And I'm not talking about this sonic grey paint, because this car is £50,000. It's got the pedigree, but can it really be worth that price? I think it's fair to say that the Honda Civic Type R has never been a shrinking violet. It has been a rebellious, in-your-face, don't care what everybody else thinks type of car. And whilst the new one continues this tradition in some elements, its suit is slightly svelter. It hides itself a bit more, a bit like somebody with really aggressive tattoo sleeves might put on a long sleeve shirt to go and see their mother-in-law. The profile will seem familiar because it's based upon the 11th generation Honda Civic, but where things start to get tasty is in the details. Take a look at the bonnet. There's a pair of bonnet louvers there to help better cool the car, but also relieve pressure as it builds at speed within the car's bodywork and engine bay. Where does that air come from? There is a great big domineering frontal area with massive grills. There's actually 48% larger grille openings in this car for better cooling, particularly when thinking about track use. Lower down you'll notice there's a wide front splitter that channels air around and actually through sections of the car to help cool things like the brakes. There are some aerodynamic gills on the side here that then lead down into these lower side skirts that further channels the air around and manipulates it round the rump of the car. Now whilst we're at the back of the car, you'll see that something that has returned, as in most generations of Civic Type R, is that Grim Reaper's scythe of a rear wing. It's very foreboding. But it does serve an aerodynamic purpose. It has this arc in the middle of it. It bows upwards to help create an area of low pressure which sucks air underneath it. Lots of people think that it's the top surface of a wing that does all the work. Actually, it's underneath where air pressure is changed and manipulated, where downforce is generated. But why does a front-wheel drive hot hatchback need downforce? Well, if you're creating a load of downward pressure up front, you need to balance it out at the back to have a more neutral drive. Lower down you'll find a large, quite aggressive diffuser, more aggressive than we saw in the previous generation, but it does house that now signature triple turret exhaust pipe. Aerodynamic stability and downforce is incredibly important to a vehicle like this with this level of performance. It is longer, it is lower, it is wider. But when we talk about downforce, a lot of car manufacturers will say the car has X downforce, but actually very rarely you get to a point where the downforce cancels out the natural lift of the car at speed. The Civic Type R is one of the few hot hatchbacks with genuine downforce, that total figure being in the region of 90 kilos. You might have noticed that these new alloy wheels are heavily inspired by those of the outgoing limited edition Civic Type R. They might be an inch smaller in terms of diameter than before, but actually they're wider. They're holding much wider tyres, these ones being Michelin Pilot Sport 4 tyres. Peeking through the spokes you'll find great big Brembo disc brakes ready to arrest progress for you to tip in to the next apex. Clearly the car is much more subtle than it ever has been before, but it's all relative, isn't it? Because you park this up next to any of its contemporaries and it still looks like it wants a bar brawl.
The interior of the FL5 is a fantastic fusion of both old and new. It's a modern environment, but the red carpets hark back to the original Integra Type R. The cascading dashboard is dominated by a 10.2-inch touchscreen display, which is a marked improvement on what came before. Speaking of displays, the driver gets a new 9-inch driver's display, which is customizable and full of really rich graphics that change and alter as you build and go through various modes. A distinctive trait of any Type R are its very bolstered seats, and here they return once again in their glorious shade of red. Excessive support for shoulders, ribs and thighs suggests that this car can generate some notable G-force. Fit and finish for the vehicle is very positive, although there are some scratchy plastics a bit too high up in the cabin, something that makes you question that price tag. However, the crown jewel has to be that manual shifter with its teardrop aluminium shape, harking back to this being a true driver's car. The Honda Civic Type R is only available with 3 pedals in the footwell. Whilst the Civic Type R only seats 4 as opposed to the standard Civic's 5, the rear quarters are plenty spacious with lots of head and legroom. Open the boot to reveal 410 litres of space, which is pretty generous, but it is 10 litres less than before. Overall, it remains amongst the best in class, and plenty big enough for a puppy Rottweiler called Nala. Fold the seats down and you have an incredible 1,212 litres of space.
So out on the road then, what are the headlines? Well, under the bonnet is a 2-litre turbocharged VTEC engine that should be very familiar to anyone who's experienced the FK8 Type R, which is the generation before this one. Though it's not exactly the same engine because it's been put under the microscope to help relieve friction in the engine. It breathes a little easier now thanks to a new exhaust system. There's also a faster spooling turbo, and it's all to enable faster responses from the engine. And I have to say, considering this engine is heavily turbocharged, it does exactly that. The power comes in nice and low, but more importantly, that torque is such a strong surge from relatively low in the rev range. Overall, you have 324 brake horsepower, though a little less if you're in America due to the octane rating of fuel out there, and overall 420 newton meters of torque. That performance potential translates through the front wheels for a 0 to 62 mile an hour time of 5.4 seconds and a top speed of 171 miles per hour. And yes, a lot of competitors have gone all-wheel drive, whilst the Type R has remained front-wheel drive. And actually, short of playing top trumps and winning on 0 to 60, I think that's a very good thing, for reasons I will come on to. All of that is translated to the road via a 6-speed manual transmission, and this is where you begin to see the hints of where Honda are going with the Type R. This is a driver's car. There is not an automatic option. Frankly, putting an auto in this car should be a crime because this manual gearbox is nothing short of delicious. Really lovely, short, mechanical throws. It's counterweighted really nicely. The way that kind of aluminium ball bearing style gear knob on the top just slips through your hands. It's an utter joy to have a car with 3 pedals in this class still. And it's turning into something of a USP. More and more are going auto, more and more are going all-wheel drive. I think it's fair to say that something like an Audi RS3 or a Mercedes AMG A45, yeah sure, point to point, I think you probably are going to be faster if the road's relatively straight. But my mum could drive those cars quickly. The Type R is a calibre of vehicle that demands something of its driver, and that is part of the ethos of remaining front-wheel drive. Firstly, you save a load of weight, but secondly, it means you can play with the weight transfer much more in the car. So as you start to nibble on those deliciously bitey Brembo brakes, the weight shifts forward, the back end goes light, and you can neatly pivot the car round a bend. This beautifully weighted and sensibly ratioed steering, it's an absolute marvel. It's been tightened up even more than before, and it feels so precise. It's almost an element of telepathy that guides you from corner to corner in this car, and the driver-machine communication is there consistently, coming through the chassis, coming through the steering, and there's no sponginess to this brake. It's got a real great feel, which means you can modulate it so accurately. Now, as mentioned, there's rivals out there that will do a 0 to 60 time faster than this car, but the way this thing pulls beggars belief. I mean, you would believe it was faster than its 5.4 seconds to 60 because it's the torque you really feel in the engine. We all get hung up on power figures, but actually the torque, the mechanical muscle of this engine is so incredible. It really sends you back into these beautifully bolstered seats. And yeah, as you charge through the gears, it's so rewarding to keep on top of this engine. Like I said, there's less turbo lag than ever before. The engine's really responsive. It's crazy linear for a turbocharged car. There's still a little bit of turbo lag. Naturally, you know, the laws of physics and the way the vehicles are engineered is the way it is. I don't think there's two ways of getting around that, short of we're seeing some cars come in with electrical spooling turbos, which kind of negates the build-up of pressure if you know how turbocharging works. All fascinating stuff, but this is kind of, it feels a little bit like the last of its kind. It's a breed of car that really demands something of its driver. It demands that you pay attention. It demands that to get the most out of it, you really understand the physics of what is going on when you're behind the wheel. And I think anybody who is a true driver, a true enthusiast, will absolutely relish that over all-weather grip, over being able to do launch control in the car park. This car is just as at home on these B roads as it is out on a racetrack. Speaking of roadworthiness though, these Michelin tyres are actually a better bet than the Continentals that the previous car was on. The Continentals were really good, though they had a relatively short lifespan. If you pushed them too hard, they kind of got past their best quite quickly. These tyres are a bit of a harder wearing compound, they're definitely a better all-weather compound. The only thing I will say, I'll caveat that, on cold, wet conditions, you still get a lot of kind of slip grip, slip grip, slip grip. And that's basically because the tyres need a bit more heat in them in order to get the most out of them. But on drying roads like today, and you're following that drying line, the sun is out, and the country roads that we go down here just continue to get more and more and more demanding of the driver and the car. It is so rewarding to have a tool that feels so fit for purpose for our quite unique, kind of twisty, windy, narrow roads. New for this generation, the Civic Type R actually has 4 selectable drive modes. So you can start off in sport, that's the natural state of the car feels very alert, the throttle responsiveness is good, there's good weighting to the steering, and the ride is what I'd describe as firm but fair. You can go down into comfort, which of course slackens everything off, less throttle response, less weight to the steering, dampers soften up, so it just makes it a little bit more compliant. I'd say it's probably the most compliant Type R there has ever been, but it's not Rolls-Royce smooth, obviously. The calibre of car we're talking about here is quite focused, so naturally when you do go over a pothole, you notice it. Now above sport sits individual, and my goodness, this is something that Type R's been waiting for a long time, a configurable drive mode. I thought this in its predecessor, where everything was great about the car, except on our rather rutted roads, I would like to slacken off the suspension, because the last thing you want to do is upset the car into a very technical off-camber bend, for example. In this scenario, we can have that softer suspension, but keep the throttle response and keep the weighty steering, and you can really tailor the car to how you like it. Final mode has become a staple of the Type R, and that is Plus R, and that is where the car takes it to its ultimate conclusion. We have the maximum in throttle responsiveness, the chassis is at its most alert, and the car is, I can't find a better word than angry. It is so eager to chew on the tarmac as it fires itself down the road. You take full advantage. I mean, keep in mind, there's a lot of power going through the front wheels here. The mechanical differential on this car is excellent. There's still a little bit of torque steer, but a firm hand on the wheel keeps hold of that, and it actually informs you a little bit on left to right how the tyres are gripping up individually. But also the dual axis suspension, which is a super clever piece of engineering which really helps fight torque steer, unlike demon hot hatchbacks of maybe the late 90s and early 2000s. This car is supremely well behaved in that regard, but also it does remind you at times not to take the mick. Steam into corners, particularly with electronic aids off, and you'll notice there's a lot of chassis movement, and that's great. That's for you to keep on top of, and that's part of the joy of this car remaining front wheel drive. But it needs that firm hand to absolutely get the most out of it. Now there is an auto blip function for the throttle when you change down a gear, as you just heard there. Now, keen drivers who really love heel and towing, you can turn that off in the settings, which again is a nice sign that Honda are in tune with the kind of people who buy this car. But also, if you want to look like a hero in front of your mates and not make a fool of yourself, the system is there to catch you. It's also a good bit of engine protection whenever you're really thumping through the gears and maybe enjoying yourself a bit too much to be paying attention to that. FL5 really does feel like the culmination of all of its predecessors, all of those lessons learned. And let's not forget that the FK8 Type R that this replaces won numerous awards. It was the undefeated hot hatch champion, and the FL5 just somehow elevates that even further. It just takes an even tighter grip on that crown. At that eye-watering price point, the FL5 had to be one of the best Honda Civic Type Rs in its history, no question. Do you know what? I'd actually go one step further. I think the FL5 is not only one of the best hot hatchbacks on sale today, I think it could be one of the best hot hatchbacks ever.